Hello and welcome to the Undisputed MMA show presented by the FTN Network. My name is Jonah Shiffman. I'm joined, as always, by John Kelly, and we're going to be talking UFC Vegas 34 going down this weekend at the Apex. John, we had a week off from the UFC last week, had a couple other shows on, but I'm happy to be back on the grind. We've got 12 fights going down this weekend. We got Kelvin Gastelum versus Jared Cannonier in the main event, and it should be a pretty decent card, one I'm looking forward to. I already have, I think, 3 plays on the card. Should be a couple more before the weekend starts. But before we hop into the 12 fights, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, man. Excited. Like you said, we had a week off. Definitely excited to get back to it. You know, it's always like once the beginning of that week is off, we're like, it's kind of nice to relax, reset, get an early start on the next card. And then it's like by Monday of fight week, you're like, man, I'm itching to watch some fights. So I'm super excited. Like you said, we have a decent card as well, a few good betting spots, and I'm sure we'll go over some drafting strategy as well, because this is an interesting slate. We have a lot of expensive options that may or may not be the most trustworthy fighters. So excited to hear your thoughts and ready to get into it when you are.
Yeah, for sure. It's one of those weeks where you go up to the top of the DraftKings pricing board and you see a guy like William Knight at $9.4 thousand or Chase Sherman at $9.2 thousand, and you just kind of get thinking, this might be one of the more wacky weeks in terms of DFS. As we'll talk through the slate, obviously all 24 fighters. We're recording a little earlier than normal. We're live, so if you're in the chat, say what's up. Always love doing the live shows, but about 10 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday and Mountain Time, so like noon Thursday. So we're before the weigh-in. So hopefully everything we talk about on the show will hold true in about 24 hours after the weigh-ins are over. But without further ado, let's get into the first fight, John. We got Ramiz Brahimaj. He's a small -140 favorite against Sasha Palatnikov, who comes back +120. The DraftKings prices for this fight, Brahimaj is $8.5 thousand, and then Palatnikov is $7.7K. And this is an interesting price because I think kind of regardless of what you made of a guy like Brahimaj prior to his UFC debut, who was a guy who most of his wins came by first round submission. He seemed to be a good grappler on tape, but there wasn't a ton of information about how he would fare at the highest level. He closed as a +118 betting underdog to Max Griffin in that fight. And I think if you had told anyone, kind of regardless of the outcome, that he would be -140 to a guy like Sasha Palatnikov, who we've seen in the UFC twice, and he's won, and basically his win came due to just kind of outlasting Luis Kosei, who gassed out super bad in that fight. I think it'd be interesting to see that Brahimaj was -140, but you go back and watch the fight, John. I mean, Ramiz Brahimaj in his UFC debut gets finished in the third round and basically does nothing up until then, right? Like his record, his tape, he looks like this super high action fighter. He's going to go for takedowns early. In fact, the knock against the guy is he probably uses up too much energy early in fights, but he just really did mostly nothing, looked like a deer in headlights, and ended up losing in the third round. So I think it's interesting, to say the least, that he's only -140 here against a fighter at the level of Palatnikov. So I'm interested, John, what's your take in this fight? Do you think Brahimaj bounces back, or are we kind of out on him in general? And this price makes a little more sense than it would have a few months ago.
Yeah, Brahimaj trains out of Fortis. I don't know what it is with the Fortis camp. Like, they must tell their fighters, like, hey guys, I know you come from a wrestling background, or I know you, in this case, I know you come from a grappling background, but let's not do any of that. Let's just, low volume, fight on the outside. Like, it just, I hate it when people don't use their biggest strengths. And to me, that's his grappling. You mentioned the jiu-jitsu, former no-gi champion, aggressive. I think he's only a purple belt, but very aggressive with his submission grappling. And coming into that matchup, I'm feeling good. I have this big number on Brahimaj by first round sub, 7 of his 8 wins, all by first round sub. Like, that's what he did coming up to the UFC. And I'm like telling everybody, like, this is an awesome line. Like, you got to hit this. I'm getting my hair cut like the Thursday before fight week. I'm telling my barber, like, bro, this is the spot. And then, like, he doesn't even watch UFC. And then he texted me Saturday and he's like, this guy's a grappler. And I was just like, oh man. And I know, shout out to Paul Shaughnessy. I know we talked about that as well, because he was in the same boat as me. Like, that we just thought that submission was so likely, or at least so likely for him to go for it, which he obviously didn't. But yeah, I think this is a good spot for him. You mentioned Palatnikov, really in that fight against Luis Kosei. Kosei came really close to finishing him in the first round. And like you said, he basically just Kosei death gassed. So it wasn't anything that Palatnikov did that was really special to win that fight. It was just like, hey, I'm breathing and have a pulse, so I'm able to, come back and win this fight. And then his follow-up matchup against Impa Kansaganai, that's where you really saw the defensive grappling holes. He was okay in the first round, but as soon as the second round started, Impa just, basically just charged at him and forced the grappling. And once he forced the grappling exchanges, it was not even close. Like, he ended up taking the back, no hooks in, and submits him. And for those that don't know, that, basically any basic level of submission defense, you roll to your back and you're out of that choke. Like, maybe he would have gotten finished regardless, but it's like, that was very clear that that's pretty alarming to me. And now he's going up against somebody that's actually like a really good grappler. And not that Impa is not a good grappler, but I wouldn't say he's as good of a submission grappler as Ramiz Brahimaj. So it's just the fact that, like, the submission is very clear to me, but I'm also worried because Brahimaj he wasn't even remotely interested in grappling in his UFC debut. So I played it, but only for half a unit at plus 195, just because if he does choose to grapple in this spot, I think he finds a submission at a much higher clip than the current line suggests.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mostly agree with your breakdown. Shout out to our boy Danny Lags in the chat saying, what up? Glad to have you guys watching live on a Thursday afternoon. In terms of how this fight breaks down, I think if you're playing Brahimaj inside the distance or submission line, you said plus 195 you got, John, on sub?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's probably the way to approach it. You look at this guy, record, tape, that's how he's going to win fights, is being super aggressive early on in fights, going to that grappling base, and just kind of pulling some numbers from these guys. And it's really easy to do stuff like WikiCap and just look at their records, but I think that this kind of stuff, not only in terms of their record, but also just the way these two guys fights, Ramiz Brahimaj in fights that have ended in the first 10 minutes of a fight, so the first 2 rounds, he's 8-0. If it gets into the last 5 minutes, he's 0-3, and it's been finished, prior in the later rounds of a fight as well. Even his last fight got finished in the 3rd round. And I know that was kind of an interesting scenario where his ear essentially fell off the side of his head. It wasn't like he was, getting beat up super badly, but at the same time, like, he was clearly slowing down. It was pretty much one-way traffic for Max Griffin. And then on the other hand, we got Palatnikov. He's 3-0 in fights that get past the 2nd round, and 3-3 before then. So it's just kind of one of those things where Palatnikov's been finished in all his losses. If Brahimaj is going to win this fight, which I expect him to do, I think he is a higher level fighter for sure. It's going to be early. It's going to be by submission. I think we should be targeting that on DraftKings because it'll come with a takedown and then obviously the 90-point bonus for a first round finish. But I think Palatnikov's kind of way of winning, and maybe this is oversimplifying it, but like, he just needs to survive a round or two. And I think the striking is going to be relatively competitive. And, I don't have a ton of great things to say about Palatnikov in general, but he does things, you know what I mean? Like, if the fight gets extended and Brahimaj looks like a deer in headlights again, where he's not doing anything, like, Palatnikov's going to be throwing volume. I could easily see him winning this on the scorecard. So decently low level fight. I do expect Brahimaj to get the win early on probably the first takedown, but not someone I'm trusting with my money, especially after what he pulled last time out in the UFC debut. Let's move on to our second fight of the night. We got Roosevelt Roberts minus 145 against Ignacio. Bahamondes comes back plus 125 as the underdog here. We got Roberts at $8.4 thousand on DraftKings. Bahamondes is 7.8K. And I bet Roosevelt Roberts in this spot, which probably sounds familiar to listeners of the podcast. I just can't quit this guy. He doesn't have a ton of MMA experience. I know the results haven't been there lately. He lost to Kevin Kroom and Jim Miller back-to-back last 2 times out. I did cash on the under in the Jim Miller fight. I also cashed a Vinc Pichel ticket a while back against Roosevelt Roberts, but for the most part, it's been a lot of tickets on this guy that have not come through for me. But I'm high on the talent of Roosevelt Roberts, and maybe if he lets me down another time here, I'll hop off the train. But at this point, it's just a scenario where I think I'm higher than most on Roberts. I know that clearly there are some IQ issues in terms of getting himself into poor positions, especially grappling. There are some issues in terms of urgency and being a finisher at times, but I'm just not that high on Bahamondes. Coming into the Makdessi fight, I didn't bet Makdessi because there was such a big size advantage, but like, Bahamondes is a decent kickboxer, but really his best quality, in my opinion, is his length. But he only has 1 inch of height advantage here, 1 inch of a reach advantage. These are both pretty big 155 pounders. And he's just a weak grappler on tape. He's been submitted in 2 of his 4 losses. Like, if Roosevelt Roberts comes in here and wrestles, which we've seen him do before, and wrestles urgently, I think he looks like a -3, -400 favorite in this spot. So if they stay standing, if Roberts doesn't pursue the grappling, I think he would be unwise to do that. But I think it's a decently close fight still. I'd favor Bahamondes in a pure striking battle, but I don't know. I think Roosevelt Roberts comes in here, grapples, and looks like a pretty big favorite. So I played him at -133 for a unit and a half. I played that last Saturday, I want to say, but there's -145s available. I'd still play that for a unit. -150, same deal. So I think this is a pretty good spot, bounce back spot for Roosevelt Roberts. Jon, am I crazy? Should I have gotten off the train, or are we going back to it one more time with Roosevelt Roberts?
Yes, please. Let the record state that I, John Kelly, beat Jonah Shiffman to a line for maybe the first time in the history of this show. I bet Roosevelt Roberts, I think August 8th. So like 11 days ago, I got him at -120. So I echo all of your same thoughts. I really like this spot for Roosevelt Roberts. It's not that I think Bahamondes is terrible. Like, he comes from a high level kickboxing background, but he certainly has some holes, right? Like, he's super hittable defensively. Like you mentioned, I think Roberts can keep it at least competitive in the striking because Bahamondes does struggle defensively, and Roberts isn't a terrible boxer himself, but it's really the grappling edge that I keep going back to here. And Roberts has looked to grapple in pretty much all of his fights. So it's not a situation like Ramiz Brahimaj, the last fight that we talked about. It's not a situation like that. Like, I actually do trust Roberts to go to that grappling where he does have a huge edge. So where I think the striking's relatively even, I think both guys could have some moments. It's the grappling that heavily favors Roosevelt Roberts. So I bet him, I think it was 1.8 units to win 1.5 at -120 on FanDuel. I would even play him at the current line for a unit. I think if he goes to the grappling like I expect, then I think he looks like a pretty decent favorite here. And I actually took a half a unit stab at submission at +410 as well on FanDuel. A little bit off market. If you shop around, that is, I think, the best line available. And just like if you expect him to go the grappling, +410 is a pretty big number for a guy that has a pretty big grappling edge over his opponent in this matchup. So I like Roosevelt Roberts here quite a bit, obviously in the betting market, but also on DraftKings. I think he has a little bit of upside as well.
Yeah, I certainly think there's upside on DraftKings, and I love what you said about the submission prop. I hadn't actually seen that number on FanDuel, and looks like it's still out there. That's a good shout because, if we're betting, if Roberts is going to look -200, -300, like we think he might, there's no way that submission would ever look 4-1 in that scenario. I think he's pretty reliable to get a significant amount of taps in this spot should he get the fight to the ground kind of early and often. So that's a good shout. I might add a little play there. I don't want to get too much tied up on Roosevelt Roberts just because he has kind of shown a tendency to let us down in the past, but I do think this is a really good bounce back spot for Roosevelt Roberts. Let's move on to our third fight of the night. We got William Knight against Fabio Cherant. Knight is -175 favorite. Cherant is +150. That line has kind of moved pretty significantly throughout the week. If you bet Cherant last week, we've had 2 weeks off from UFC, so this market is fairly mature at this point. It's been up for at least 10 days since our last UFC card, kind of when limits go up, that kind of stuff. You could have gotten him in the +200 range, down to +150 now. The DraftKings prices for this fight kind of more so reflect the earlier pricing in the betting market. So we have Knight as our most expensive fighter on the slate, despite being just -175 in the betting market. He's $9.4 thousand on DraftKings, and Cherant is 6.8K. And Jon, I'll let you take this one first because I think this is an interesting matchup. You look at William Knight, and this guy looks more like a bodybuilder than he does or an MMA fighter. He's just absolutely ripped in muscles in places that I didn't even know existed on the human body. A super strong guy, kind of looks like a green fighter, but certainly has the pure strength to get by anyone. And then with Cherant, I didn't know what to make of this guy before his UFC debut against Alonzo Menafield. He had just gone 5 rounds in LFA. I thought he looked pretty decent, but some of his previous fights before then, I was kind of like, I don't know if this guy is necessarily UFC level. Goes in there, gets submitted by Alonzo Menafield in 70 seconds, which I don't think was the result that many were expecting. So I just think it's kind of hard to place a number between these two guys. I do think Cherant early made sense in the +200 range, but I'm kind of curious, what do you make of this fight at the current market?
Yeah, right off the opener, I'm like, maybe I'll have interest in Fabio Cherant here. But really, after looking into the matchup and taping it, I just couldn't get there. There's so many things to me That's concerning on both sides. Seeing William Knight as a sizable favorite is definitely a little bit concerning. And I wouldn't bet him at the current line for what it's worth, but I also wouldn't bet the underdog here. I think there's a lot of things that can favor Knight in this matchup. I think he can get off with leg kicks quite a bit. He does mix in the wrestling a little bit. He's not a good wrestler or a technical wrestler. His takedowns really just come from out muscling his opponents to the ground. And I think that can work against Fabio Cherant, who's a willing grappler. Like he's more of a grappler than a striker. We saw him, pull guillotine against Alonzo Menefield, like you mentioned, and ended up getting submitted when it was really just like he got squished like by shoulder pressure. But you don't really like to see that. And against William Knight, who I think is going to be a little bit more active. Cherant's pretty low volume on the feet as well. He does have some decent kicks. He does have some good kicks himself. I mentioned the low kicks of William Knight. Cherant's more of a, go for the body or go up top type guy, but he just doesn't do enough in the striking to where I can really, how does he win outside of like maybe a knockout, which I don't know how likely that is here. Plus you have to factor in that he's probably pretty likely to end up on bottom in maybe a round or two. So I do actually favor William Knight here, but when it comes to DraftKings, and you mentioned he's the most expensive fighter on the slate, I mean, I would definitely want to get underweight to that number just because there's a lot of ways that he can underperform in this matchup. I know he has a lot of knockouts. He's obviously super, super jacked, super ripped. That knockout is always possible, but I mean, I would be betting against it here, at least in the first round. And really to pay off that salary, it has to happen in the first round, unless he's just getting multiple takedowns and gets like a late second round stoppage. But outside of those two scenarios, he's probably underperforming his price tag here. So I like Knight to win, but I'd be underweight to him on DraftKings.
Yeah, we're recording our show a little bit earlier than normal, so there aren't necessarily great like ownership projections. The DraftKings slate is over 2 days away at this point, so a lot of shows that are like ours, content that comes out in the industry that just kind of morphs ownership percentage hasn't come out yet. So I don't want to go out and say, I'm going to be underweight on William Knight if he ends up coming in at like 8-10% on a 12-fight slate like this, just because we don't know for sure. But assuming that William Knight gets decent ownership, which, I would expect, he's put up large scores before with 4 takedowns and a win before. He's not someone I'm necessarily looking to target. And I don't think he'll be super popular because it's not like this guy's minus 400 and we don't think he's going to get a first round knockout. He's like minus 175 and we don't think he's going to get a first round knockout sort of thing. I do think there's wrestling upside here. I think Cherant is likely to play off of his back should he be taken down, and I do expect him to be taken down. So I think Cherant plus 200 made sense because it's just kind of like a breathing body against William Knight at plus 200 probably has value. But at this point, we just haven't seen a ton from him. He's probably going to play off his back if he gets taken down. Doesn't have a ton of power on the feet, even though I do think that I know his record is 2 decisions, 5 submissions in his 7 wins. I do think he's probably the cleaner boxer in this matchup. William Knight is just very stiff on the feet to me. I don't think Knight is very good. I don't know. I hope he dominates and we can fade him next time out. But I think if you got on Cherant early in the betting market, you did a pretty good job. But at current market, I think it's a relatively easy pass. And speaking of passes, we can move on to the next fight. At least for me, this one's going to be a pass. We got Bia Malecki. She's minus 160, 8.6K against Josiane Nunes, plus 140, $7,600 for Nunes on DraftKings. And John, you're shaking your head no. As I said, this fight's going to be a pass for me. I guess I won't even introduce it anymore. I'll just toss it over to you because you clearly have more of an opinion than myself. Talk to me about this fight between Bia Malecki and Josiane Nunes.
Yeah, Nunes is coming. That's really all there is to it. She's making her UFC debut here. She's basically a low-level power puncher for this division, which, I'm not super excited about, but I'm also really low on Bea Malecki, and I bet her against who was it? Miranda Grain or Duda Santana? Is that right?
Yeah.
Who did she fight in her debut?
Yeah.
Okay. So I bet her there. So she came through, but it wasn't pretty. She lost the first round, I think, ended up just lucking into a good position and choked her out. And Duda doesn't have much grappling either. But she is extremely hittable on the feet. She is a liability defensively. She's super tall and long for the division, but she has no idea how to use her range. And there's always a chance she could make improvements, but it's really the the defense on the feet is a very big problem for me in this matchup. Like Nunes is going to be much, much smaller, and it's going to be funny looking at like the face-offs or the weigh-ins. Like she's going to look way smaller. Like she's I don't even know the height difference, but I think it's like 6 or 7
inches of height and reach. So it's certainly significant. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's obviously like looking at the size, you're like, whoa. But when a fighter like that has no idea how to use those attributes, it really doesn't factor in at all to me. Like, you know, Veronica Macedo was able to close distance at will against her, and Macedo pieced her up the entire first round and then just completely gassed out because she went way too hard. And then she was just like shooting desperate takedowns. And once again, Malecki just ends up in dominant positions. But Malecki is just a fade moving forward to me until we start seeing some serious improvements from her. You know, she's only 4-0, still very green. The striking isn't there. The grappling is like whatever. Like, I wouldn't say she's a terrible grappler, but I wouldn't say she's a good grappler either. She just sort of, you know, if you go back and watch her fights, she just ends up winding up in these dominant positions. She doesn't actually work to get herself there and earn those positions. So it's kind of more luck than anything, in my opinion. And just against somebody who is at least powerful and who is going to be aggressive in the striking, it makes me have interest in the underdog here. I wouldn't play her at the money line. I wanted to, but I need a bigger number than that because, you know, she winds up on her back a lot. There's obvious concerns with her as well. But I did take a small poke, half of a unit on Nunes by knockout at plus 470, I believe is the number on FanDuel, 460 or 470. It's just really a fade on Malecki. She's going to eat a lot of big shots here. And I think Nunes is powerful if she swarms her to maybe get her out of there early. So yeah, give me Josiane Nunes in her UFC debut.
Yeah, and look, I don't have any problems with the KO stab. Like when we talk about Malecki, it's one of those things where she's in some fighter with a ton of experience, right? Like she has 2 UFC fights, she has 4 professional fights. And it's just one of those things where, yeah, she has a 7-inch height advantage, 7-inch reach advantage. She's going to move forward for sure. Like I think in terms of a decision, like the optics will fully play out in her favor where she's going to be the one pressuring. She's going to be the one landing, you know, the cleaner punches, I think. But the thing with Nunes is she's going to swing as hard as she can. And Malecki gets hit in the face all the time and basically blocks punches with her face. You said it best. Like she doesn't know how to use her length at all. So I don't know. It's not a fight I want to get super invested in. I think Malecki probably wins a decision, but the opportunities are certainly going to be there for Nunes to just kind of wind up and throw overhands. And she might flop to her back a little bit and do stuff that you wouldn't normally be a fan of. But it's a low level fight. And I think that she's plenty live to get a finish. So I definitely don't hate the way you played this one. Let's move on to our next fight. We got Brian Kelleher, Boom Kelleher, minus 175 against Domingo Pilarte, who comes back plus 150. 9K for Kelleher on DraftKings. Pilarte is plus or is $7.2 thousand on DraftKings. So in terms of this fight, I actually was going to get involved pretty early on this one. I think actually before the last UFC card even ended, Brian Kelleher opened at minus 146 on FanDuel. And I thought there was value in that number, but I wanted to tape Pilarte a little bit more. His last fight lasted, you know, no time at all. He hasn't fought super frequently. I just wanted to familiarize myself with the guy. He hasn't fought in a year and a half, and that fight took 30 seconds. So it's not like I knew. We're studying 20 to 30 fighters each week to do this show. So it's not like I had a ton of memory regarding Domingo Pilarte in my head. So I wanted to go back and watch it. And by the time I did, the market had kind of already corrected itself to the minus 165 range. It's now minus 175-ish. And I think that's about right. Long story short, like Brian Kelleher is a higher level fighter than Domingo Pilarte for sure. I think he has him covered in most places, but it's a big number to lay on a guy like Kelleher whose metrics really aren't that great. Like he gets hit a lot more than he delivers punches. He obviously has a great guillotine. He's a finisher for sure. 6 UFC wins, 5 of them come by finish. But in terms of up until the finish, he's not necessarily a great process-driven fighter. Like his grappling's decent, but he doesn't shoot that many takedowns. He gets taken down. He doesn't land a lot of punches, but he does have power for the weight class. So I think he has advantages in almost every aspect of MMA here against Pilarte. And the only one I could see Pilarte having some success with is if he were to shoot a bunch of takedowns, but then you have to get past the Kelleher guillotine, which he has 3 wins by in the UFC, and is just like one of the most, I think we were even talking about it like a few weeks ago. It's just like a signature finishing move that not many guys have, but Brian Kelleher certainly does have one. So yeah, I think Pilarte has a chance to win the fight, but overwhelmingly, I think that Kelleher minus 175 is about right. It's just not a price I'm comfortable laying, considering that the guy, he isn't always, doing great before he wins. You know what I mean? Like, he's one of those guys who's oftentimes losing rounds. And so that works for some guys. It's just laying minus 175 on someone who has competitive fights up until a finish just isn't a spot I necessarily want to be. But, he does have finishing upside in terms of DraftKings. $9,000 is a steep price to pay, but there's no real big, massive favorites. I don't think there's a favorite over minus 200 on this card as of Thursday. So, yeah, certainly has a chance to get that first round bonus via knockout or submission, I think. John, what are your thoughts here on Pilarte versus Kelleher?
Yeah, I'm really in the same boat as you. I thought that was a good breakdown. You hit on the biggest thing for me is like Kelleher is not a great minute winner, which is why he's tough to trust as a sizable favorite here. But again, like he probably finishes this fight a decent amount of time too. So like I do have interest at 9K on DraftKings just because he is a finisher. You mentioned the guillotine. I could see that playing out in this fight just because I expect a lot of wrestling and grappling. Pilarte, that's clearly his game plan, even against Kelleher, who's a decent grappler. I think he's still going to look to wrestle. I think he's going to look to land takedowns here. I could see Kelleher snatching up that guillotine like he's done in the past as well. And then on the feet, I think he's the better boxer. I think he's much more powerful. And we just saw Pilarte get one punch dropped by Journey Newsome, which I know is a no contest, but people don't forget. So I'm trying to get some Kelleher here on DraftKings, but as far as the betting market goes, it's a pass for me.
Yep, I think that makes a lot of sense. Let's move on to our next fight. I'm going to let you go first here, John. We got Luis Saldana, a small minus 125 favorite against Austin Lingo. Comes back about an even money underdog in this spot. Saldana is $8,300 on DraftKings. Lingo is 7.9. And both these guys coming off of their first UFC wins. For Saldana, that was his UFC debut after getting a win over Vince Murdoch on Contender Series. And then for Austin Lingo, came in, lost to Yusuf Zalal, but came back his last fight against Jacob Kilburn, looked pretty good in that fight, got the victory. I'm kind of curious, what do you make of this fight? Two guys who I guess are trending upwards, kind of, as opposed to where I would have originally capped them coming into the UFC.
Yeah, Austin Lingo, another Fortis guy, like we talked about earlier. It seems like we have a lot of, I think the last card we had a few Fortis fighters.
Well, they were in Houston last card, so there's always a bunch of Fortis fighters on those.
Yep, and it seems like they got 2 or 3 this card as well. But yeah, this is an interesting matchup because Saldana is a guy who I look to fade in his UFC debut against Jordan Griffin. I had a nice bet on Griffin there. I thought for sure we were getting our hand raised. I think you might have bet Griffin as well.
Yeah,
it seemed like everybody, especially everyone on MMA Twitter, was on Jordan Griffin there, and I think we were all collectively surprised at the decision. But I went back this week. I rewatched the fight. I think on fight night I might have tweeted out that it was like one of the worst decisions I've seen in the past couple of years, of course. But going back and actually watching it definitely wasn't the worst ever. I still don't think it was the right decision, but you go back and watch the fight, it really comes down to how you score the first round. And the first round, Saldana started off very, very good. He won the first 2 minutes. He didn't just win them, he dominated them. But then Griffin clearly won the last 3 minutes. So it's like, who do you really, and he wasn't like dominating, but he did win the last 3 minutes. So it really came down to how you scored that first round. It seemed like, I guess the judges gave it to Saldana. But when you look into this matchup, Austin Lingo's a guy who, in his UFC debut, one of the biggest favorites on that card against Yusuf Zalal. And that matchup, I think, is relevant here because we know the game plan of Yusuf Zalal is he's going to stick and move on the outside. He's going to, use that footwork, use that quickness, and then mix in the wrestling as well. And he had a lot of success doing that against Austin Lingo. But it wasn't just the wrestling. It was the quickness in his jabs. Like he's not super powerful, but he was touching the face of Austin Lingo repeatedly. Like Lingo did not know how to cut off the cage, and he was just a step behind in the striking. Like you mentioned, William Knight being stiff. when it comes to the boxing. Like, I definitely see that in Austin Lingo. Like, he's a good boxer, but he always wants to just load up for that power punch. And that's why the quicker guys with fast hands like Yusuf Zalal and Luis Saldana, who I'll reference in this matchup, I think I see a lot of similarities to that matchup. I think Saldana is going to be just quicker. I think he's going to be beating him to the punch. He likes to switch stances a lot. That footwork, I think, is going to give Lingo a lot of problems in this matchup. But, I think it's lined about right. I'd put Saldana as a small favorite. That's where he's at. I know a lot of sharp guys are on Austin Lingo. If you got him early, I don't hate that stab as well, because I do think it's going to be a close fight. But no action for me. I did kind of peep fight ends by KO, but it wasn't a good enough number. I think it was plus 195. I wanted, plus 250 or better there. But I just think this is generally going to be a war. I think both guys are going to land a lot of volume. And I think both guys are capable of winning by knockout here. So I think it's one in terms of DraftKings that you could probably hedge a little bit. It probably ends by decision at a decent clip as well. So I wouldn't make either guy a core piece, but yeah, I lean Saldana. It's not the most confident lean. No action for me though.
Yeah, so you mentioned you made Saldana a small favorite. I actually make Lingo a small favorite in this fight. I did bet him at plus 126, so about 20 cents ago. So I don't think I'd play him at current market. It's closer to accurate. I would probably flip it, make it like Lingo minus 115, Saldana minus 105, stuff like that. But at plus 126, I thought there was enough value to take a shot. I think your points about kind of how Zalal made Lingo look slow and was kind of chasing him around the cage as opposed to cutting it off makes sense and is certainly relevant in this matchup. But at the same time, I think Lingo is a more proven fighter with kind of just more tools than Luis Saldana. Like, Saldana is very kick-oriented, stays at range, loves to run around the cage, which, we've talked about has given Lingo some issues before. But also, if you go back and watch the Lingo versus Zalal fight, it just seems like he wasn't completely in it. Like, UFC debut, it just seems like a totally different guy than when he fought Jacob Kilburn. And, Kilburn isn't a super great opponent or win to have. But Lingo looked good in that fight. He had a takedown in the third round. Before then, he had a knockdown in the first round, was really beating him up bad. Like, I think Lingo has a massive power advantage here. So it's kind of binary in the sense that, like, if Saldana can keep him at kicking range, just kind of waltz around the cage, he probably wins a decision. But Lingo's just kind of proven more to me in the Kilburn win than Saldana did against Vince Murdoch, who was undersized in that fight. And I don't even think Vince Murdoch is that good to begin with. I know he was on The Ultimate Fighter. I just don't really think he's a UFC level guy, more of like a regional journeyman, but not a bad win for Saldana. But then against Jordan Griffin, like, I clearly thought he lost the fight. And even if you go back and look at it through the lens that he won, he didn't defend takedowns great, which I'm not sure will be a massive factor here. Like, I do think Lingo could out-wrestle Saldana, but I'm not going to go in counting on a Fortis guy to have a super plus EV game plan, as you kind of alluded to earlier. But, like, he hits way harder. I think he closes the distance. And, like, the Griffin fight for Saldana was close in terms of the striking. Like, it wasn't like he even blew him out in the striking. And I think Lingo would probably hurt Jordan Griffin on the feet in the striking. So, yeah, I'm on Lingo here. I make him a small favorite. It should be a competitive fight, but I think he marches forward, lands the bigger shots, and is deserving of a minus number next to his name as opposed to the plus 126 that I was able to scoop up. So, John, anything else to add on this fight, or should we move on to what I believe is the most fun fight of the card?
No, let's do it. Brandon Royval fights. You never want to wait too long to get into Brandon Royval fights. So let's do it.
Yeah, that is absolutely right. We got Brandon Royval coming back to the octagon this week. One of the most exciting fighters in the UFC, in my opinion. He's a plus 155 underdog here to Alexandre Pantoja, who's a division staple down at flyweight. Pantoja minus 180 in this spot, $8.9 thousand on DraftKings. And then Royval, as I mentioned, is a plus 155 dog, $7.3 thousand on DK. This is we mentioned this is a fun matchup. Like, when Brandon Royval fights, it's absolute chaos. I mean, this guy, for better or worse, is going to come forward, fight for your money. He's going to get hit in the face a lot. He's going to hit his opponent in the face a good amount. He's probably going to flop to his back at some point. He's probably going to, be crazy scrambles on the ground. And Alexandre Pantoja, I mentioned a division staple. I mean, this guy has fought pretty much the best that this division has to offer for a long time. And is a solid fighter in his own right. Like, he's technically, I think we could all agree, he's a better striker and better grappler than Brandon Royval. probably more so than a minus 180 would suggest. But the skills of Royval and his length, I think, are a really difficult puzzle kind of for anyone to solve. Even Brandon Moreno, there were some competitive moments in that fight. The Kai Kara France fight comes to mind. I mean, Brandon Royval, I think, for what he lacks in like technical MMA skill, like all the MMA nerds who are like super into like technique and stuff, they hate Brandon Royval because they like can't wrap their heads around the fact that like this guy is just going to bite the mouthpiece and like throw everything you know about like punching technique out the window, because he's going to throw spinning elbows, and if they miss, he's just going to flop to his back and throw up a triangle choke. So the nerds hate on Brandon Royval, but John, I think you love Brandon Royval. Is that right?
Yeah, that might be an understatement. He's quickly becoming one of my favorite fighters. You know, I loved him even in his debut when a lot of other people were calling him like this fluke submission earlier bust guy. But yeah, you know, you hit on the biggest thing is like, I think there are certain people who, you know, they work all their lives and they get to a certain point just because they're so talented. And then there are other people that are just born to fight. And I think Brandon Royval was just born to fight. And that's exactly how he fights in the octagon. So that's why it's always fun to watch him fight, because no matter what, you know he's going to bring it. So even if he's outclassed in multiple areas, because when you talk about Pantoja, this is a guy who was lined as a small favorite against not just the current flyweight champion, but also the previous flyweight champion. Like, that's how good he is. I still consider him top 3 in this division. So where it's like, I think Pantoja is just more clean in pretty much every area. I don't really want to pay the price tag, especially at minus 180. You know, if he was like in the minus 130, 140 range, then sure. But at minus 180, you know, I think that's about right. Plus, I don't like betting against an underdog in Royval, who I know is just, you know, those type of underdogs are always going to be live because they're just going to create chaos. And I think that's something that he can do in this matchup too. So this is another one, no action for me, but this is the one I'm most excited to see on the entire card. I think it's going to be super fun. I think we're going to see some nice striking exchanges, but also some really exciting grappling exchanges as well. And that's what I'm most excited about here. In terms of DraftKings, I think both guys can score well just due to the high-paced nature of this fight. And I do lean towards a finish, but I wouldn't be surprised at a decision either, just because Pantoja especially is very durable. You know, Royval's kind of an under machine, but I wouldn't be shocked if this went to decision either, outside of like a fluke injury, like the Brandon Moreno fight in his last fight. So yeah, this is my favorite fight on the card. It's no secret there, but yeah, I definitely favor Pantoja to win the fight.
Yeah, I played the under here, actually. I played under 2.5 rounds at a plus 127. I played it right before we hopped on. I tossed it on the FTNbets.com in our bets tracker. I think it's good to about plus 120, which is around where most of the market is at this point. You mentioned like Brandon Royval is an under machine, and I understand that Pantoja has close to 30 professional fights and he's never once been finished, but Brandon Royval just has that nature about him where it's kill or be killed, and he's going to go for the finish, and he's going to get hit in the face a lot because he has an under 50% striking defense, and he's going to be doing a lot more of the action than Pantoja. Like, I think Pantoja is just going to kind of be there and counter striking, and Royval's just going to charge at him. But I do think there's going to be a lot of grappling, and when we talk about the grappling here, you know, I think Pantoja is probably a better pure wrestler, and he's certainly a better positional grappler, and probably even a better submission grappler as well. Like in a gi, I think he would tap Royval over and over again. But in MMA, Royval is so submission over position, where he's going to sacrifice positions like mount, like side control, for stuff like arm triangles or arm bars that are low percentage. And sometimes, especially with stuff like arm bars or triangles, which Royval loves throwing up, you're not only sacrificing your current position of being in a dominant spot, but you're likely putting yourself on the other end of that spectrum and getting your opponent into a dominant spot should they get out of the submission. So I just kind of think it's one of those things where like Royval's going to pursue the sub, and if he doesn't get it, Pantoja is going to end up in a good spot. And if Pantoja has your back, super slick transitions. Even I know you go back in the Askar Askarov fight, one of those back takes is like one of the nicest back takes I've ever seen. He ended up losing that fight, but like, I don't know. I think that Pantoja is much cleaner. I expect him to get a finish here for Royval, but I would not be surprised if it happens the other way. And Pantoja decision is live as well. I don't think a Royval decision is very likely. I just think a lot of his equity in a win comes from a finish. So at $7,300 in a GPP format, Brandon Royval is someone that I'm certainly going to be targeting this weekend in the DFS streets for sure. John, anything we want to add about the potential future fight of the night, or should we move on to our next fight between Vinc Pichel and Austin Hubbard?
So the only thing that I'll add is I can definitely see Royval getting to be very popular as an underdog, just because people know exactly all the things we just said, like his style of fights, the way that he fights. He's come through as an underdog, I think twice now, if I'm not mistaken. But regardless, he's a very popular fighter. He's cheap on DraftKings, and the upside is there. So I can see him becoming very popular, which actually gives me more interest in Pantoja, because we both think he wins the fight. We both think he's a better fighter. And let's not forget, how good he is as a grappler and a striker. And I think the finishing upside is there as well. So it gives you a decent amount of leverage against the field. So I'm definitely interested on both sides, but I think I'd lean towards Pantoja just for that extra leverage against Royval.
For sure. And that's a good point you mentioned. We had talked a little bit earlier about how, it's still early in the week in terms of ownership. It's a little bit more difficult to project, but that's the kind of stuff in terms of leverage that we really try to go over pretty much all day on Saturday before the fight card starts over at the ftndaily.com Discord. It's free. We have a super fun community over there talking about, all sorts of strategy stuff in terms of not just like play this guy, don't play this guy, because we do a lot of that on this show. But on Saturday, you really kind of know where the field's going. Where does the leverage lie? Where can I kind of stand out and become plus EV in relative to the rest of the field? So definitely hop in our Discord. That's the kind of stuff that goes down pretty much all day on Saturday, and has really helped me become a better DFS player. And I'm sure most people in that room feel the same way. Let's move on to our next fight, John. We got Vinc Pichel versus Austin Hubbard in a straight pick'em fight, minus 110 apiece. We got Pichel 8.2K on DraftKings, Hubbard $8,000. So this is that fight in the mid-range where if you have a strong opinion, ownership is likely to be somewhat split. The betting odds indicate that it's exactly a 50-50 fight. I happen to think that it is not as 50-50 as other people do. I think that Vinc Pichel deserves to be a favorite here. And surprise, surprise, I'm betting Vinc from hell, because John always makes fun of me every time that a Vinc Pichel fight gets announced. It seems like I'm on this guy. But in all seriousness, I think he deserves to be a favorite in this spot against Austin Hubbard. And he opened as a favorite, but the Hubbard money has trickled in. I have not pulled the trigger yet. I think there's a minus 105 sitting on BetMGM for Pichel that I've been eyeing. And if the market doesn't move, I'll likely take some of that. But I'm greedy. I'm hoping he moves to a plus 100. I'm going to have probably a unit or a unit and a half on him. I was considering playing him at minus 130, where this line was about 10 days ago. I don't understand what people think has changed in regards to Austin Hubbard. This has always been a guy that when you look at Austin Hubbard, if he's fighting a grappler, which it seems like he's doing in every fight, I don't know who is taking these fights for him. Maybe he's just a super determined guy, and it's like, I want to face the toughest challenge, and he knows he struggles with grapplers. But he certainly has not had any favors done for him by the UFC. Davi Ramos, Marco Madsen, who we'll talk about in a minute, Joe Selecki, those are three guys who have given him all of his UFC losses, and those are high-level grapplers, but it's the same thing in every fight. Like, Hubbard struggles to defend takedowns, especially chain wrestling, and then gives his back in every fight. I cashed a huge bet on Joe Selecki against him when he took his back up against the cage. It played out. That was one of my most satisfying wins. I'm not going to say it was like the best bet in the world, but it was one of those satisfying wins where I kind of called it to like an absolute T. And I feel really strong about my reads on both these guys' fights in general. Like Hubbard in his last fight out against Dakota Bush, some early adversity. He lost the first round. I personally thought he won the first round, but it was definitely close, and then took over down the stretch against a late notice opponent. But for Austin Hubbard, like, he's great cardio. We saw him outlast your boy Max Roshkov in the past, where he's taken down early in that fight and then would live to tell the tale about it late when Max kind of gassed out. But it's one of those things with Hubbard where, man, if you have the right blueprint to beat him, I feel like you beat him pretty consistently. Like, he's certainly a UFC level fighter. He's a good striker, good cardio, decent first level takedown defense, but he keeps facing these grapplers. And when Vinc Pichel, Vince is older. He's not necessarily some dominant grappler, but like, he's going to shoot takedowns in bulk. He averages almost 4 of them per 15 minutes. He taught Roosevelt Roberts a lesson. Jim Miller took down repeatedly in that fight. I also nailed that fight where I bet on Vinc Pichel live against Jim Miller. I just feel like in general, and that's not me victory lapping these guys, because there's a lot of fighters on these cards that I gotten wrong a bunch in the past, but these are two fighters that I feel really strong about, just kind of my baseline reads in general. And this matchup, I don't know. I just think that Pichel is going to go out there Hubbard has great cardio, but is a slow starter. So like he probably is going to lose round 1. And Pichel is someone who historically takes over down the stretch as well. So it's a weird dynamic where Hubbard is so used to coming back. I don't know if Pichel is the easiest guy to come back on, as he typically gets stronger throughout the fight as well. So a little bit of a long-winded breakdown there, especially considering I haven't put in a play yet. But there's a 100% chance that I will have my money behind Vinc Pichel this weekend. It's just kind of a matter of when do I enter the market. So, John, you've been nodding along. I imagine you are on the same boat. Have you bet Vinc Pichel yet, or are you kind of waiting as well?
I was waiting all week, and then it looked like we might get some plus money, and then the tide started to change a little bit, and I thought it was going to go quick back towards the Pichel. So I got at minus 115 on FanDuel for a unit. Jay Brandt in the chat, shout out to him. He's a Discord member. But he said over under for Pichel takedowns. I mean, I take the over on 1.5. If you'd give me that line, I might take the over on 2.5. That would be, I think, probably the line to set.
I hope somewhere we could bet on 1.5. I think I would smash
one. Yeah, 1.5. I feel confident taking the over there. 2.5 is probably the right line. But I still maybe lean over. It's just, I guess I do lean over just because Hubbard most of the time doesn't get stuck on his back. He is okay at least working out of positions and working back to his feet. So yeah, I'll take the over on 2.5 as well. I lean with you. I'm on the Pichel side. Like I said, I bet him at minus 115. And when it comes to DraftKings, these guys are both priced in the mid range. We always want to favor the guy with wrestling upside. You know, Pichel lands takedowns in pretty much all of his fights. Hubbard, 58% takedown defense. I know he's had a rough schedule, but this matchup is not a good matchup for him. I don't really understand the line movement here. I'm not even like fully convinced that Hubbard like dominates the striking either. Like Pichel's not a terrible striker. And I think the wrestling is just so clear to me that even if he's not landing takedowns, I think he's going to have a lot of cage control time as well. So I think Pichel's the better minute winner here. I think he gets the job done. And I definitely favor him on DraftKings for the wrestling upside. So it sounds like we're on the same page once again on this one, Jonah.
Yeah, I love me a good like grinder against a striker. I love those matchups. You know, Pichel isn't the best wrestler in the world. Like we've seen guys like, I mean, it's unfair to compare him to like a Gregor Gillespie, who is probably the best pure wrestler on the entire UFC roster at this point. But like Pichel was dominated in that matchup. There have been guys to out wrestle him before, but he's just kind of someone who knows his skill set and is just going to look to push you against the cage, grind you out, and drag the fight into deep water. So I'm glad we're on the same page there. It's a spot I feel pretty confident in, considering it's a pick'em fight headed into the weekend. Let's move on to a fight that was announced yesterday. And just before we get into this, I actually have not done a ton of tape on I'm going to try this name, Saidyokub Kakramanov. I have watched him before against Asker, not to be confused with Asker Askarov. That fight ended super quickly, so I haven't seen a ton of tape on him. But in terms of this matchup, we have Trevin Jones as a decent favorite at this point, minus 145. Interesting market movement where he opened kind of on the offshore books that have like $200 limits. Opened like minus 300 yesterday, and I have the alert set up on my phone for the Twitter account, best fight odds. And so I got the alert and I was out at dinner and I saw that and I was like, interesting, because I haven't watched a ton of Kakramanov, but it's one of those things where like, I certainly don't think that Trevin Jones should have been minus 300 against him. And then the line flipped and we had Trevin Jones as an underdog for a hot second. Limits still fairly low. The market was just kind of correcting itself. It's kind of settled at Trevin Jones minus 145. We've got a lot more books open up the fight. FanDuel has it up. DraftKings, all the big legal books have it up. And I think that's about right from what I've seen. You know, Trevin Jones, I was ready to fade him with Ronnie Lawrence 2 weeks ago. He is 2-0 in the UFC with 2 knockouts, guy with good power, honestly a better grappler than striker on the regional scene. So we do know he's decently well-rounded. I just thought the Lawrence matchup was going to be really tough for him. With Kakramanov, like I mentioned, I haven't done a ton of tape, so I'm not going to pretend that I have some, super in-depth analysis for this fight. But minus 145 for Trevin Jones, as an underdog, I think I probably would have blind backed Trevin Jones if the limits were higher, I would have put in a play. Just one of those things where like guy who has UFC level experience, has looked good, has a well-rounded skill set with no glaring holes. And then we got to remember, like, this is 3 days notice. The fight's on Saturday. This fight was announced on Wednesday. I'm happy Trevin Jones got an opponent because he's had a bunch of fights canceled. But John, I'm kind of curious, have you done more research than I have in terms of the Kakhramonov side? And kind of what do you make of his skills and his chances this weekend on 3 days notice?
Yeah, I have. I actually did have a little bit of time to go back and watch a few of his regional fights, and I don't think he's a bad prospect. He certainly has some power, but I would say he's fairly one-dimensional. You know, he definitely is looking to get in there and bang. And this is another fight that I think, you know, has potential fight of the night vibes. You know, maybe not quite the Pantoja Royval scale, but certainly it's up there for this card. Just because I think both guys are exciting. I think the style of both guys is probably going to lean towards a finish. And that actually might be a later ad for me on the Trevin Jones side, because I think he does win, and I think it probably comes inside the distance. I'm just sort of trying to figure out how the best way to target it this fight is. Whether I want to play an under or whether I want to play a Jones prop. I just sort of have to think through it a little bit more. But Kakhramonov, it's clear that what he's going to do is he's going to look to move forward and just like bite the mouthpiece and swing heavy bombs. And he does have clear power. There's no denying that. But, you know, that's only going to work until you reach a certain level. And I'm not saying that Trevin Jones is like a super high level UFC athlete, but you mentioned, you know, he does have the UFC experience. He does have notable wins. And I just think he's just a better, well-rounded fighter. He's a former Nogi world champion, I believe, black belt under Robert Drysdale, which is a legitimate black belt. And I just think he's a better fighter all around here. So it's always possible when you're facing a guy that has who is dangerous with his hands, it's always possible that he can win by knockout. But I think the more likely scenario is that Jones looks like a much better fighter here, especially when you factor in the short notice of Kakhramonov. Jones has been training, you know, for weeks now. This is like his 5th opponent in the past few weeks that he's had to prepare for. So yeah, I like Trevin Jones here. I think he's clearly the side, and I think he gets a finish come Saturday.
Yeah, last thing on this fight before we move on, I just wanted to mention is I have watched Kakhramonov before while I was taping Umar Nurmagomedov. They fought in PFL a few years ago. And kind of what I got from that fight is that Kakhramonov is not as good as Umar Nurmagomedov, which not really a surprise. But he's like a decent striker, and he didn't look totally lost in the grappling realm. Super strong, solid guy. Like, I know Trevin Giles is a pretty good grappler on tape, but I'm not sure he goes in with a super grapple-heavy game plan, considering he's won his first 2 fights by standing KO. So it might be a thing where he might fall in love with his hands a little bit, which I don't think is the worst decision in the world. Like, he seems to be a good striker, but also like Kakhramonov is not a guy who's just going to fall over if you take him down. Like, he's a pretty solid, well-rounded guy. He's one-dimensional on his offense in the sense that like he's going to win. It's going to be, if he wins, it's going to be by KO, but he's not super one-dimensional in the fact where it's like, oh, you can just take this guy down really easily, or he has one big hole in his game. So I have watched, 20 minutes of tape on the guy. I think he's decent. I think the current market is about right. Although if I had to take a side, I think I'd probably lay it with Jones at current market. That's about all for that fight. We got 3 left to go. We'll move on to our featured bout, which will be a heavyweight scrap. And you just know when they put a heavyweight fight in the middle of the main card after some fights like Pichel, Hubbard, Jones, Kakhramonov, Pantoja, Royval, which are all going to be fun fights. You just know that this is going to be like a decision fest of like hugging each other against the cage. We got Chase Sherman against Parker Porter, 2 extremely large men set to throw down this weekend. We got Sherman minus 190, $9,200. Porter comes back plus 165, 7K flat on DraftKings. And I won't spend too much time with my breakdown here. I'll just quickly go before tossing it over to you, John. This number seems right to me. I mean, like, it's a heavyweight fight. I never like to lay a minus 200 number, especially when it's going to be pure striking. Like, Chase Sherman ain't going to be going in there and taking down Parker Porter, but I don't know. I think he has a durability edge. I think he has a speed edge. His striking arsenal is much more. He's got a wider arsenal of kind of strikes that he's able to rely on. Porter is super predictable. I feel like he only has 1 or 2 punches that he kind of goes to consistently. Has wrestled a bit on the regional scene, but not something where I think he comes in here and like puts on a top control clinic against Chase Sherman very often. So I think Sherman's a deserved favorite. I think he probably wins, goes in there, kicks the leg a bunch of times, lands some jabs. He puts a pretty good volume, at least this iteration of Chase Sherman back in the UFC. I think he's a decent fighter, but I'm not laying minus 200 on a heavyweight in a pure striking matchup, especially when it's not like a top 5 guy. So yeah, I favor Sherman, but not a spot I'm looking to get super invested in. John, what do you think about DraftKings for this fight? First of all, give me your breakdown in terms of the betting market, of course, but I'm kind of interested what you think. To me, at 9.2K, it seems like Sherman probably has one of the best chances for a first-round knockout on the slate. But Porter, win condition, also likely comes to be a knockout early in this fight. So I'm just kind of interested. What do you make of this one between Sherman and Porter for DFS purposes?
Yeah, I don't really have too much to add in terms of the breakdown. Like you said, it's a low-level heavyweight fight. Both guys are big. Both guys have some power. Both guys can win by knockout. But like you, I also favor the Sherman side. I trust him to be more aggressive, especially early in the fight. I think he has a little bit more power. Both guys, I'm not really sure what their durability is. Both guys have been knocked out a few times, some worse than others. But like you, I favor the Sherman side. In terms of DraftKings, to answer your question, I actually do have a decent amount of interest in Chase Sherman here. Obviously, Porter, you can consider him a live underdog as well. But I think the knockout comes from the Chase Sherman side, just because I think he's more experienced. I just think he's a level better, even though it is low-level heavyweights. I just think he's better, and I trust him to be more aggressive, especially early in the fight, like I said. So I think the upside is there. If he lands that knockout in round 1, on a slate like this where there's not a bunch of expensive people that we trust, we talked about William Knight being the most expensive fighter. I definitely favor Chase Sherman here. If he gets that first round knockout and all those other 9K options just kind of don't really get there, then obviously you're going to need him. So I'm fine with taking a decent amount of Sherman, but it's a high risk, high reward fight. I'd say.
Yeah, for sure. Basically, yeah, exactly. Like, it's one of those things where our friend of the show, Gugabe, always says in heavyweight fights like this, if it goes over 1.5, it's going the distance. You know what I mean? And I don't know if I fully feel that way here, because I do think that Sherman has good cardio and kind of is able to do more cumulative damage as opposed to most heavyweights. Like, he does kick the leg, he'll go to the body a little bit, does have a good solid jab, but it does feel like one of those matchups where like someone probably goes to sleep early, but if they don't, it gets significantly sloppier as the 15 minutes go on. So it's one of those things where like Sherman has a super high ceiling, but the floor in a win is not that high, considering he's not going to wrestle. His volume is decent for heavyweight, but he's not just competing with heavyweights on the DFS slate. Like, we have Brendan Royval on the slate. We have Bia Malecki, who lands 7 strikes a minute on the slate. So I think that he's a super high variance play in terms of the ceiling is high, but the floor is pretty low in any kind of a win for him as well. So that kind of takes care of the heavyweights on the main card. Let's move on to a matchup that should be pretty wrestling heavy in our co-main event, one that I'm certainly looking forward to. Excited to get your take here, John. We got Mark Madsen, minus 155 favorite. We had spoken about him a little bit earlier in the show. Last fight was a win over Austin Hubbard, and he takes on Clay the Carpenter Guida, plus 135 for Clay. He's $7.1 thousand on DraftKings. And there's certainly been some market love for Clay Guida throughout the week. He opened a small favorite on the soft openers. Madsen took, I think, a lot of deserved money, ballooned out to like a minus 170 favorite, but this line has come down a bit. Guida now plus 135, plus 145, depending on where you look. And I think this is an interesting matchup, right? Like, Mark Madsen, everyone knows, former silver medalist at the Olympics, like a guy who is super Greco-based wrestler, came out here and took down who was that? Belwardo in his UFC debut. I don't think Belwardo landed a strike. It was like a takedown on the ground and pound, and then it was over. And Austin Hubbard took him down, 8 times in that fight in the first 2 rounds, or 8 times throughout the fight, but came out there and broke his jaw, I believe, in the middle of the fight, and was gassing out bad in the 3rd round. It was one of those things where, like, if Austin Hubbard had any sort of power, he probably gets Madsen out of there in the 3rd round, like a pretty dominant standing round for Hubbard. But Madsen was up so big before that he still holds on for the win. Seriously high-level MMA wrestler. Clay Guida, on the other hand, is a pretty decent MMA wrestler in his own right. I do understand some of the love for Guida in terms of, look, he's going to present some challenges for Madsen that he hasn't faced before. We mentioned Austin Hubbard as someone who you can wrestle consistently. Guida probably does not present that sort of same challenge, or lack thereof a challenge, I should say. He's going to be, scrambling off of his back. He probably gets taken down this matchup, but I do think that there'll be some competitive scramble stuff like that. So I understand some of the Guida love, but when it comes down to it, like, Clay Guida without a wrestling advantage is not that great of a fighter. And I understand that his striking still may be better than Mark Madsen's because we really have not seen anything from Madsen on the feet. But Madsen has a great guillotine if Guida is to shoot his own takedown attempts, and he has really solid ground and pound. So I think there's a cardio advantage for Clay Guida. I think a relatively small striking advantage for him as well. So I understand some of the underdog love, but look, I know Madsen, I think he's 36 or 37 years old, clearly was a prime athlete in the Olympics at one point. I'm not sure that he's still an elite athlete for the next 5 years in MMA. Like, I don't know if he's going to make a title run at this point, but he's a seriously explosive guy for at least 7.5 minutes to start a fight. And I just don't see a ton of paths for Guida to win the first round or even maybe the second round either. So I like Madsen to win the fight. DraftKings, I mean, clearly a guy who, it's no secret, he lands over 8 takedowns per 15 minutes. He's going to go in there. He's going to wrestle. I think he's going to be popular and probably well-deserved. But look, if you like the Clay Guida side, that's someone you could certainly get underweight on, depending on how the field kind of shakes out on Saturday. So I'm super excited for this matchup. Clearly, I've been talking about it for a hot minute. John, I'm going to toss this one back to you. Do you side with the Guida train, thinking that like he could come in here, present some challenges that Madsen really hasn't seen, some resistance for a guy who hasn't dealt great with adversity in the past? Or is it one of those things where like Madsen is just at such a level wrestling that it's going to be a non-competitive first 5-10 minutes of the fight?
Yeah, I tend to lean with the latter. I think Madsen's wrestling is just better. I really do. I think he wins round 1 at a really high clip, and I think he wins round 2 at a decent clip. And this is kind of one of those spots where it's like we don't really know what the cardio of his Madsen. Obviously didn't look great against Hubbard. This could be a situation where he wins round 1. We need him to win round 2 because we know Clay Guida is going to bring it for 15 minutes, and Clay Guida, if Madsen starts to slow down at all, Clay Guida is probably going to win round 3. So he really needs to win the first 2 rounds here outside of a finish. And I think he can do that just because I think the takedowns are going to be there. You mentioned the wrestling credentials of Clay Guida, but especially at this stage in his career, like the takedown defense, like I think it's only like 70% or 68 or something like that. But when you look at it over the course of his career, like he had pretty good takedown defense early on and for a decent stretch there. But over his last few fights, at least the ones that have involved wrestling, it really hasn't been there. Bobby Green took him down twice with little resistance. When you go from a guy like that, who's not a great wrestler, an okay wrestler in Bobby Green, and then you go to an Olympic level wrestler, Mark Madsen, I think the takedowns are going to be there. I think he's going to bang some control time. The concern with Madsen is he typically doesn't do enough with those takedowns. Like, we need more activity on the ground. I don't think anybody's going to tell you otherwise. In that Austin Hubbard fight, yeah, the control time was great while he had it, but he's not doing anything. And even against Hubbard, like, I thought he struggled to really control him for periods there. But yeah, I think he can land takedowns here. So for that reason, I'm going to target him on DraftKings, and I'm okay targeting him pretty heavily, even though I'm not super confident. Like, I wouldn't say he's like a lock to win this fight, but it's just the upside is inevitable. And so I'm always going to target those, a guy like him who could literally break the slate with the amount of takedowns and control time. And then you factor in, Clay Guida, these guys are maybe similar in the age category, but Guida's got many, many more miles on him in terms of the fight game. So yeah, I lean Madsen. It's not a confident lean, but in terms of DraftKings, it is a confident lean. And I'm okay with making him sort of a core piece in your builds this week.
Yeah, and you mentioned right there just kind of in terms of like wear and tear in total fights. I think it's interesting because Guida is older, but probably has better cardio. Like Clay Guida, anyone who's seen him fight, I mean, this guy will go to war for 15 minutes and then is still like running around the octagon as Bruce Buffer is getting ready to make the decision. Just a complete psychopath cardiovascularly. But something I wanted to ask you about is Guida's had 56 fights. He had 55 leading into the Michael Johnson fight. He's 39 years old. I don't know if his hands have ever looked as good as they did in the Michael Johnson fight. Obviously he's been around for a long time. He's clearly past his prime, so they probably have at some point. But in this current 35-plus-year-old version of Clay Guida, I thought his hands looked really good in the MJ fight. Do you think that's kind of more of like a Michael Johnson being Michael Johnson sort of thing? Or maybe Clay Guida is like discovering, I don't want to say he's a totally new guy at 39 years old, 55 fights in, But like, I think if you're backing Guida, like that's certainly an encouraging sign. That would maybe take his marginal striking advantage over Madsen to a significant one. And you mentioned like Madsen against Hubbard took him down the first round. He didn't land a single significant strike. And sometimes DraftKings, when they're scoring or fight metric, significant strikes are kind of totally subjective and up to who's watching it, but he only landed 2 total strikes. So it wasn't like they weren't getting scored significant. He just wasn't doing a ton of damage. So I kind of wanted to ask you, like, what did you think of Guida's hands in his last time out? Because if Madsen's not going to do any damage on top and it comes down to, Madsen had 2 minutes of control, but they stood for 3 minutes and Guida had the better shots. I think it's interesting. Like, what do you make of Guida's kind of stand up against MJ?
Yeah, I thought his hands looked good as well. And I think I would give him the striking advantage here. It just comes down to, I think he's going to be forced to defend the takedowns or just be on his back for the majority of minutes here. So I still lean I favor the wrestling advantage of Madsen over the striking advantage of Guida, basically. It just comes down to how long we think Madsen can keep up that pace, at least long enough to win those first 2 rounds if we think he gasses out and maybe loses the third. So I tend to think that he does, but again, it's not the most confident lean on the entire card for sure.
I have no idea what the odds are for this, but I would not be surprised if there's a way too inflated number on Guida to win in round 3. If he were to survive the early storm and just kind of catch him in some sort of submission in round 3. We spent a lot of time in this fight. I'm not going to look it up. I probably won't bet it myself, but if you're not betting this fight and you're looking to throw down some like pizza money or whatever people call it, I think Guida round 3 is probably like at least 12 or 15 to 1 and probably plus EV at that point. I just think Madsen really controls for the first 10 minutes and kind of front runs his way to a pretty dominant decision victory here. So let's move on to our next fight, which is the main event of the evening. We got Jared Cannonier against Kelvin Gastelum. We got Cannonier currently minus 145, Gastelum plus 125. If you shop around, there are numbers as high as plus 135 I saw on the market currently for Gastelum. And that's significantly lower than it was at this point last week. Jared Cannonier opened a pretty decent favorite in this fight. It's pretty much been one-sided market action in terms of the KG side. And I think it makes sense. I think this is a relatively competitive fight between two guys who are certainly not at the top of the division. I mean, I guess Cannonier was a fight away, right? Like he fought Bobby Knuckles his last time out. It's pretty much as close to the top of the division you can get as long as you're not fighting the champ. But yeah, I think this is an interesting matchup. Kelvin Gastelum went to war with Israel Adesanya, and I feel like we've had this conversation a bunch of times on the podcast, but since then, he's lost 4 or 5. The one win is over Ian Heinisch, who Ian Heinisch might not fight in the UFC again after his last time out. But Jared Cannonier, I think the story is kind of well known as well. Guy started at heavyweight, has kind of moved his way down consistently, and is now pretty massive at middleweight. Got pieced up pretty bad by Rob Whittaker his last time out, but was probably a fight away from fighting for the title. So I think this is an interesting one. Probably going to be mostly striking unless Gastelum were to mix in a takedown or two. I do make Cannonier a small favorite. I just think he probably lands with more power. I think he's probably a better point fighter in terms of the volume over 25 minutes. But look, I wouldn't be surprised if Gastelum won this fight. I think it's a winnable matchup for him. Gastelum probably has some wrestling upside in this matchup and certainly has KO upside as well. Both these guys certainly hit hard. I'm kind of curious, what do you make of this fight? Like, do you think it stays standing for the entirety of the 25? And how would you grade out both these guys as strikers, John?
Yeah, I definitely don't think it stays striking for the full 25. I think Gastelum, I think we do see a little bit of that wrestling, and we saw it. Like, he really went to the wrestling against Ian Heinisch, landed 6 takedowns. That was the best his wrestling has ever looked, for sure. He's typically, mix in a takedown here or two, but 6 takedowns, and that was a clear game plan for him in that fight, and it worked out well. And I think that could be a potential path to victory for him here. Cannonier, while he's super strong, I think as the fight goes on, I think Gastelum could have some success with those takedowns. Like, I think if Gastelum tries to mix them in too early, I think he's going to get stuffed, but at least making him defend them and making him think about them, just more things to think about rather than just a kickboxing match, where I do favor Cannonier. I think he's much more powerful. If anybody's going to win by knockout, I think it is Cannonier, but he's also a guy who's kind of relied on his power and those knockouts. And Kelvin Gastelum, we know he's as durable as anybody. He's never been finished, and he's been to war with, Israel Adesanya. Like you mentioned, he's fought everyone who's anybody in this division. So I think Cannonier clearly has the striking advantage, especially early. But I do like the fact that Gastelum, he's a good boxer as well. I think he can keep it competitive in the striking, especially as the fight goes on. This is a guy who's very experienced with 5-round fights. Cannonier has never gone past 3 rounds. I know he was booked 5 against, the Jack Hermanson fight, but that didn't last over 3 rounds. I think it was finishing round 2.
I think that's his only main event.
It was his only main event.
Fight.
Yeah. So it's just one of those things where I think it's a close fight. I think maybe it's lined about right now that we've seen all that Kelvin Gastelum money come in. But I do think Gastelum's a live underdog here. I do favor him on DraftKings just because he at least has the potential to land takedowns here, whereas Cannonier, I'd be pretty surprised if he even tried to land takedowns here. So I do like Gastelum. I did take a half a unit stab on Gastelum by decision just because plus 410, I thought the number was pretty good. A little bit too good to ignore just because I think like you said, this is a winnable matchup for Gastelum, and he's not like a super dangerous finisher. And even if Cannonier gasses out, I don't think Gastelum like knocks him out. I'd be surprised if he submitted him. Like, I think the most likely outcome if Gastelum wins is he's competitive in the striking. He lands a few takedowns. He wins 3 of the 5 rounds and wins the decision. So at plus 410, I think the number's good enough to take a small stab there. But yeah, this is one where I think you could target both sides a little bit, but I would definitely be more overweight to the Gastelum side because Cannonier really needs an early knockout to be optimal, in my opinion. And I just don't really think it's going to happen considering how durable Gastelum is.
Yeah, I think that makes sense in terms of main event breakdown. I'll pick Cannonier as well. I think he's just a little bit more explosive on the feet, but I definitely understand, there wasn't necessarily enough meat on the bone for me to take the shot on Kelvin earlier in the week, but I do think at the current at the market prices we were at, it makes sense that we have moved towards the current market. I do think that the line was probably a little inflated. I wasn't taking the shot, but I understand the people that did. At this point, it seems pretty accurate to me because I do think that kind of a number of things have to go well for Kelvin to win the fight. And it's certainly not I think it's somewhat close to a median outcome. Like plus 120 is not a large underdog to hit, but I do think that he certainly needs to stay alive on the feet, probably be competitive in the boxing, extend the fight a little bit, land takedowns. He just has to put a few more things together than Cannonier does, which is basically kickbox, defend takedowns, and maybe I murk this guy in the first round sort of deal. One thing I just wanted to mention in terms of the DraftKings slate before I kick it over to you to take us out, John, is this week we have a ton of closely lined fights, and not like, we have a bunch of minus 110s. Like, we have no fights where there's a favorite over minus 200. So on weeks like this, especially if all 12 fights stay intact in terms of just general strategy, this is a week where I'm really looking to leverage ownership, because there's no one that is way more likely to win the fight than someone else. So what I want to do, as always, is I'm prioritizing upside. I'm prioritizing guys like Brandon Royval, who if he wins, it's probably going to have to be inside the distance. Same with Ramiz Brahimaj. If he wins, it probably has to be inside the distance. But if anyone starts to get up to a massive ownership number this weekend, kind of outside of the main event, where I do think it makes sense to have those guys in close to 100% of your lineups, if anyone gets to a super high ownership point this week, I think it's safe to just kind of leverage off of it somehow because all the fights are so closely lined. No one is a lock. No one is like 7K and plus 110 and everyone else in that range is plus 250. You know what I mean? Like there's no massive values. Gastelum at 7.5K and a 5-round fight at plus 120 is probably as close as we'll get. But he was already going to be owned because he's the main event underdog and they're always owned. So it's just one of those things where if anyone gets to massively inflated ownership, like I said, it's Thursday morning right now, so we don't have a great idea of what the ownership will look like come Saturday afternoon. If anyone gets super highly owned, I'm just kind of looking to get away from the field and kind of just get more unique than I usually am this week. You always want to be unique in these large field GPPs for MMA, but this week I'm just kind of prioritizing that even over some of my more subjective takes. So yeah, that's the last thing I have to add about the slate. John, I'll kick it back to you. If you have anything to add about the DK slate, the main event, anything like that, feel free to do so. And then if not, take us out of here.
No, I think that was a really good point you brought up. And the only thing I'll add is like we say it time and time again on this show, like we always want to favor the guys with the wrestling upside. When it comes to DraftKings, like their floor and ceiling is just, it's obvious how much higher it is. So when we have a slate like this, where we do have multiple wrestlers or guys that have multiple takedown upside, like Vinc Pichel, who we mentioned, Mark Madsen, even though we're not like totally confident that they win, it's just that in a win, their path to victory is going to involve a lot of takedowns and a lot of control time. So we're always going to be aggressive in targeting those guys more so than guys who are knockout or bust or striking based fighters. So I just wanted to add that before we get out of here. But that's it. That's it for this week, guys. I'm John Kelly. That's Jonah Shiffman. This is the Undisputed MMA show presented by the FTN Network, saying goodbye and good luck. And we will see you guys next time.